Hi, I'm Amanda Marcotte. I'm a journalist. I write at Slate's XX Factor, RH Reality Check, and Pandagon.
Hi, I'm Erica Grieder. I'm the Southwest correspondent for The Economist based in Austin, Texas. How are you doing, Amanda?
Good. How are you doing? How's Austin?
Rainy. I guess all those prayers have finally reached their source. But I guess it's a little bit quieter than in New York. I've been reading about you guys today.
Yeah, we, this morning, I woke up this morning, I rolled over, my partner was like, they raided Occupy Wall Street last night, and I was like, oh no. I think at a certain point, we actually kind of started to think here that Bloomberg may actually just let it go. But apparently it just got to him, and he, after 2 months, decided to have a middle-of-the-night raid, which I think, the explanation for that was basically, and there was some euphemism for it, but basically their explanation for that was that they didn't want the actual protesters to have a heads up. But I also believe that that was part of a larger strategy to keep the media from covering it, which has failed miserably.
Right, yeah, and it seems like one way to get the media interest really going is to do something sort of sneaky and underhanded, like this kind of action in the middle of the night. So maybe backfired from that point of view. It's I guess, not the most interesting part of this, but the Bloomberg aspect is curious, right? Because he had sort of seemed to be quite clear in saying they have a right to be there. They're protesting peacefully. That's within their rights. And was there a catalyst or a trigger for this change, a sudden uptick in neighborhood pushback, or?
No, there hasn't really been an uptick in neighborhood pushback. The New York Times had an article yesterday saying that there were noise complaints in the area from Occupy Wall Street, but that there were more from the construction at the World Trade Center. Within Occupy Wall Street, they've been really careful about trying to keep the noise to a minimum during certain hours of the day. They had a struggle with the drummers, but they only let them drum 4 hours a day, which I think is excessive myself, but I can see that at least, within the bounds of New York City, that isn't out of control. It's hard to say what the catalyst was at this point in time. Now, when this goes up, there may be more news, but there are two separate theories I've seen floated around. One is that they were going to have some large protest that was going to be disruptive. Last night there was some chatter about whether or not they were going to try and stop the subways, which I'm skeptical of. There was a more reasonable report that they were going to go to Wall Street and really cause a ruckus today, so it seems that he may have been provoked by that. The other story that's floating around is that all the mayors of the 18 cities that are struggling with Occupy protests got on a conference call yesterday, and this was somehow a coordinated action. It is worth noting in favor of that theory is the fact that President Obama left the country today, or not the country, he's in Hawaii, but he's basically off the mainland and is not as readily available to respond as he might have otherwise been.
But does that matter that Obama's not around? I mean, he's not really the point person on this, is he?
No, but I can see that if you're Mayor Bloomberg, you don't want him to be around because he might actually, be able to, from the White House, make a public statement denouncing or at least just casting doubt on the wisdom of doing this, which, I think the wisdom is quickly coalescing that Bloomberg made a massive mistake last night.
It's well, then you see a little bit of pushback too. I mean, I've read some things this morning saying that actually this is kind of a good outcome for the protesters because if you're looking at the winter coming up, I guess it's not really wintry in New York right now, but if you're thinking that the winter will eventually come, then at some point you probably wouldn't want to stay there all winter, and now you can kind of leave in a veil of glory and righteous indignation because you were forced out in a kind of shocking and dramatic and unethical way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's I think you can't deny that that's probably, isn't that nonviolent protest 101? You take the fight to the most authoritarian types. I read a blog post this morning pointing out that the civil rights activists in the 60s, because they weren't getting a lot of pushback in some parts of the country with their sit-ins, decided to take the fight to Birmingham because they knew Bull Connor would just come down like a sack of hammers on them. I think that's the point of nonviolent protest. So that's why I think it's very strange for Bloomberg to have fallen. He walked right into a trap with this. A trap, and it's fascinating. I am endlessly fascinated by how many mayors of the different cities just can't hold. Like, you have to know that if you send the police after them, there's going to be all this blitz of media that's supportive of them, and you're going to look like the bully.
It's kind of interesting though. I mean, because in a way, it does change. It seems to change the nature of the protest, right? Because I think one of the questions about this movement since the beginning has been, what are they protesting, or what is the kind of core complaint? And I think that arises with any movement that's sort of decentralized and nascent. But so in Austin, there's an Occupy Austin movement at City Hall, and it's quite peaceful and cheerful, and there hasn't been much conflict between people and police. But being in Austin, looking at the New York one, it seems like it's becoming about an authoritarian regime or being squashed down by the police, which is not the key complaint in Austin, at least, and is probably a narrower complaint across the country than the broader complaints that were raised by the movement in its first few weeks, just about inequity and diminished opportunity.
Maybe. I mean, I think, that's always a danger. I think that's a very real danger. But I do think that the fact that it's Mayor Bloomberg probably undercuts that danger a little bit, because he's like the perfect symbol of the sort of corporate government alliance that the protesters are protesting. I mean, he basically bought himself the mayorship. He's this billionaire who makes excuses for the bankers, who blamed the foreclosure crisis on poor people, who is just out of touch and spends all of his time with his rich friends, like condescendingly dealing with the poor by talking up a personal responsibility. And then he turns around and people are calling him and his friends out on it, and cracks down with nightclubs and tear gas and acoustic weapons. I mean, I think in a way you don't have a better symbol of this sort of corporate state alliance than this. Like, basically you now have the taxpayer paid for police attacking people because they're protesting corporations and corporate power and wealth inequalities.
I mean, I wonder how that reads nationally. I think there's, I think with Bloomberg, he's somebody whose profiles obviously higher on the East Coast than across the country, which is, I think, why his sort of exploratory presidential thing 4 years ago didn't happen, 3 years ago didn't happen. But he does come across nationally as a sort of self-styled moderate Republican in a major city. He has this, some data points like his donation to the Beyond Coal campaign of the summer that suggests that he's not that he's a little bit outside that kind of corporate alliance you're describing. So, I mean, is there a concern that people are going to look at this and say, well, Bloomberg is pretty moderate. He's supported these guys for a long time. He hasn't changed. He's been this guy for a long time. Maybe they really are just causing a ruckus and annoying their neighbors.
I think that's probably something that he hopes is true. I think what I'm seeing is, even in the days before this happened, there were a number of people pointing out that Bloomberg has always been this kind of jerk, that he's always been more of a Republican than he lets on in a lot of ways. And it really started when he made those comments blaming the poor and people who were foreclosed on for the foreclosure crisis, and the government for wanting people to get more people into housing, and all these different things that had nothing to do with it, really, because it was fundamentally a big scam run by a bunch of investment bankers. And, his personal frustration with the protesters in the days leading up to this, I think, are probably going to work against him trying to establish that narrative. That would be my thought anyway. I mean, obviously, I'm from Texas, but I've been in New York for 2 years, so I may be a little bit away from the way that other people are seeing the situation. But, I mean, how do you feel that you've seen more of the middle of the country?
Well, I guess that's kind of what I was wondering. I mean, in the Austin protest, Austin, you've lived here. It's got a pretty strong civil society and pretty good public-private relations, or it's got a good city council, and everyone likes the cops and the mayor and so on. So when you go to Occupy Austin, they talk about, or when I was asking the question that I've been asking of these protesters, which would be kind of what is the main injustice, who is the author of the injustice you're talking about, and what would be done to remediate it, the claims that arise are actually pretty mainstream complaints. So a big one in Austin is Citizens United, which seems a little bit wonky for an encampment type protest, but it is kind of a ridiculous decision that people are quite rightly annoyed by and have been for several years. So I think that was kind of coming out in some national polls where you saw support for Occupy Wall Street or the Occupy movement. The movement had a higher approval rating than the Tea Party did, for example. So it seemed like even it wasn't quite following along strictly partisan lines. There was a sense of this is a more broad-based movement than the Tea Party was, or the Tea Party is.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think that that's any less true in New York City where it started. I mean, I think, it's been very clear, I think, from the beginning that this is not about the existence of Wall Street, even though I think probably more protesters here would say that it is, but that's certainly, like, what matters more when it comes to a protest movement like this is what the larger world takes away from it, and I think that the larger world is looking at this here in the city, but also just around the country and around the world and seeing exactly that kind of complaint, something like Citizens United. And I do think that Bloomberg within the city is a perfect symbol for that because he's kind of the embodiment of Citizens United. He's somebody who's only in power because he's rich. Like he acts like he's the king of New York. And this particular behavior just sort of drove home that, no matter how much he acts like he's the benevolent king of New York, he certainly doesn't have to be in his own mind. And it's just getting uglier because of the injunction situation this morning where there was a restraining order put on the city telling them to let the protesters go back, and then Bloomberg wouldn't let the protesters go back. The NYPD built a barricade around there, and then they started to arrest people again. And it was just, now you're seeing an illegal seizure of power. I feel like within a couple of days, he's managed to turn himself from Mr. Happy Moderate Republican into the face of, like, he's looking a lot more like a Scott Walker or something, just somebody who just is willing to do illegitimate, illegal things in order to hang on to power.
So where does this go? Where does this go in New York then? I mean, does this become, how ugly is this going to get, do you think?
No one knows. I mean, when this is broadcast, I guess we'll have a better idea, right? I mean,
right, we'll see that.
I'll be going down there in a couple hours, so I'll see. I mean, one of the things that we're going down there this afternoon to do is their library got destroyed in the raid last week. They had 5,000 books. This was particularly distressing for me because I think it's just one of those things where it seems so unnecessary to just take all that work that people have done and just destroy it, of curating a library of 5,000 volumes. So there's going to be a writers' protest, and I mean, who knows? It depends on how much of a reaction this gets, I think.
And you'll bring your book back. It does seem kind of like a funny lesson. I mean, it seems like the best way to marginalize your protesters, if you have them in your city, is to give them some cookies or something and offer them police protection for their marches. That really kind of quiets them down pretty fast and sends the cameras home in boredom.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, last night they were like arresting journalists and barricading others away from it. Now they're part of the protest, and like journalism's been attacked, and now journalists feel free to be like, hey.
That's true. Although that could really backfire in the mainstream American public opinion. I'm not sure if the plight of the journalist is going to get people rallying to the cause. From what I see around. But so this kind of brings us though to the broader issue, which is I think there are some kind of interesting. So to me, this New York event is clouding what was the story of the past few months, which is a broader normative question about what kind of steering the economy needs for the benefit of all people, and whether that's the appropriate role of government to consider those kinds of concerns in policy. And we had mentioned via email before we started this chat that, interestingly, the evangelicals are citing the economy as their main issue in this election. Have you, I guess, do you see a lot of evangelicals in New York? Or do you keep track of them?
I have not met any evangelical Christians in New York City, but I grew up in Texas, so I am more than familiar with that subculture.
Right. So it seems like for years, and even in 2008, when there were big economic issues on the table, there was much more of the kind of traditional social conservative bugbear concerns about gay marriage and abortion. And this year, we're not hearing a whole lot of it. We're hearing, I don't know if the economy has just gotten so bad that is the dominant issue for everyone, or if there's kind of a political marketplace that's not being developed by any of the candidates or any of the states. But how do you see that?
Well, I mean, I guess it's an interesting question to me because I think that it's a two-part question, and I think it is true that the economy may be drowning out other issues or making their interest in other issues seem, social conservative issues seem a little ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is that I'm not entirely certain that evangelical Christians are a voting bloc or a political group without that, because it's sometimes the only thing that motivates them to vote. It depends. I mean, obviously there's a lot of diversity in the evangelical Christian community, but the sort of standard issue social conservative evangelicals, often they kind of, the old view of politics that was true probably up until the early 70s was that that's the world, we're not of the world. And only when it started to sort of encroach on patriarchy, on family, on their views of race relations, things that they, for some reason, didn't see as political issues, but more local, family-oriented issues, did they start to politically organize. And so I have to wonder, I can see that you may poll them, and you may get numbers off them that say they're less worried about abortion and gay rights and they're more worried about the economy. But I don't know if I see that as something that could be used to organize them, because I don't see that as something that they organize around.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I saw Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention and Jim Wallace of Sojourners speak in D.C. a couple of weeks ago. I think they had a Blogging Heads chat a few weeks ago, which I haven't watched. I just watched them speak at the press club instead of on Blogging Heads. But they both said this is an important issue, but then they, of course, proceeding from the same premise, ended up on opposite sides of the table. So I think Land was sort of characterizing the free markets idea as being the one that evangelicals will naturally gravitate towards, and Wallace was saying, in keeping with the Occupy ethos, that actually the more big state kind of safety net type issues are the ones that naturally resonate with evangelical voters who have an interest in being their brother's keeper and so on. And I think they're both. I think that you're right. There's not an obvious Christian approach to economic stewardship. I think maybe the causality is going in the other direction, that if you are a Christian and conservative, then you might just be hearing more messaging that pushes you towards the Republican line on the economy, even though in some ways the sort of Jesus as a socialist argument has more solid underpinnings. But I think you're probably right to say that they're not going to, if you have Christian voters voting on the economy, they're acting as voters voting about the economy rather than as Christian voters voting on the economy.
Yeah, and I don't think I think that economics. It's my impression that outside of a very few rarefied circles, they don't see economics as a religious issue. Period.
Right, so this raises the question, though, I think, of you've always heard over the past couple of years, like, oh, well, there actually is a lot of overlap between evangelicals and secular voters on issues like climate change or foreign aid or the death penalty or so on. And these coalitions are sort of always theorized and never actually come together. So I don't know if that's because do you think the kind of polarization is such that that can't come together, or is it just an infrastructure issue that no one's actually trying to make it come together beyond saying, hey, they could come together on this?
I think a lot of the writers who overrate how much you can use Christian theology to attract evangelical voters over to a global warming point of view or a social justice point of view are misunderstanding the role that religion plays in the Bible Belt, in red states and conservative areas. I think that they're well underestimating how much it's about identity politics, how you can't extricate the view of themselves as fundamentalists or evangelical Christians from their view of themselves as white Americans, as traditional Americans, as conservative Americans. I've just never seen any kind of indication that they're allergic at all to the sort of Republican view of economics. And to be fair, like, the Republican Party has gotten really good at selling their kind of view of, like, unfettered capitalism. I don't think, if you were to poll evangelicals and say, do you support unfettered capitalism where corruption runs rampant, they would say, no. But if you sell it to them as, we support local control of the economy and don't want the federal government meddling in your business, well, that really feeds their sort of notion of tradition. It feeds a fantasy of their nostalgic fantasy of an old America with local economy. And even though it has no relationship whatsoever to the economy that they're actually supporting with their votes, they're really attracted to that rhetoric.
But this seems like sort of if this is the case, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but it seems like kind of the argument that Thomas Frank is making in What's the Matter with Kansas, which is a book I continually disagree with, where he says that basically people have started they've calcified in this tribal mentality, so if they have some things in common with the tribe, they just follow the tribe on all the issues, and even if it goes against their own interests. I think, first of all, that seems like it is predicated on the idea that a whole block of voters who are up to or slightly more than half of the country, maybe plurality of the country, if we're talking about just conservative evangelicals, are kind of stupid or too stupid to recognize their own interests. And it also seems to be predicated on the idea that only Republicans can message or can talk about issues. So if that's the case, then why isn't it incumbent on Democrats to say, hey guys, actually, why don't you consider our point of view?
I I want to agree with you that I think Frank way underestimates the intelligence of the people that are going into this situation. What he's using, I think I think his major flaw, though, he's not wrong that they just go with the tribe and they believe in the tribe. I don't think that that's wrong. I think what he just fails to understand is that's a legitimate interest.
Right.
He's using that sort of economic rational actor theory that the only real rational choice to make is in one's economic self-interest. But there's a lot of different kinds of self-interest, and certainly when I go home now, my family is not religious. If anything, they're hostile to the religious people, but they certainly live in very religious areas, and the general sense that I get is that the pressure to conform, the pressure to have your bona fides, to be seen as a conservative person, to be seen as a traditional person, way outweighs any economic considerations. And I think one other thing that somebody like Frank needs to understand is that it's just a lot cheaper to live in a lot of these places. So they can, I think, it's not like they're like, if I don't have a social safety net, I'm going to lose my house, or I think that's increasingly true, but up until recently, I don't think it's been as true for your average conservative voter. They're usually like middle class. They may not make a lot of money, but they're certainly not going to starve to death, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, because there's this kind of behavioral economics thing that people are, so like the inside of behavioral economics, people behave irrationally, but you can do things that are economically not rational, but that still correspond to your other values. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I think I agree with that. I think I also would say that one thing that strikes me on these social issues a lot is that they're almost universally comprehensible in a way that not every issue is. So,
yes,
if you're talking about quantitative easing, that's a little bit of a specialist issue wherein it's not necessarily everyone's job to know about central bank policy that would inform their views on that issue. But everyone has some ideas about marriage or family or kids. So the kind of uptake on those issues is like 100%. Whereas I think so you might have an opinion on that and then be willing to kind of allocate your time to those issues rather than every other issue about industrial subsidies or policy in Libya or whatever else we're expected to know about in the kind of overall political matrix.
Yeah, and I mean, and also objectively speaking, those issues mattered more to you in your daily life, or perceived at least to. I mean, certainly for your average person, who you sleep with, who your neighbor gets to sleep with, like what marriage, babies, power in the household, things like that matter more in a very real way than Libya.
Right. Especially because there's this interesting paper that came out from Davos, I guess, last year. It was about capitalist models, and it was from the Scandinavian governments, and it talked about the Scandinavian model of capitalism. So it said, imagine a triangle with the state at one corner, the individual at one corner, and the family at the other corner. And it said in Scandinavia we have a really strong link between the state and the individual. So the overriding goal of our policy is to maximize individual freedom and agency, so women don't depend on their husbands, children aren't dependent on their parents, workers don't need their family infrastructure. There's like a state that is kind of their ally. And in the U.S., in this framing, there's a kind of a weaker state relative to the Western European governments, which kind of makes the family and the individual the ally. And I think that's an interesting framing because it then seems like, well, yeah, if your family structure is your network of support or your safety net, then of course you're going to be much more focused on the stability of family units and how to maximize that kind of security.
Well, don't you think, though, that that's kind of got it a little bit backwards, though? I mean, I'm hearing you read this list of traits. It was the Swedish government?
It was the Scandinavian government.
Yeah. I'm hearing you read this list of traits of the Scandinavian government's relationship to individuals, and how do you think a conservative Christian in the U.S. would react if you even just read that list to them?
Well, I guess you'd say, and you were saying earlier about if you conceive of so you consider it a matter of local control. There's that kind of libertarian attitude with regard to the state that I think conservative Christians do have. Not to generalize about them so much because you do get different segments of interest there. But if they have a general disinterest in having such a strong state that abrogates the role of the church, civil society, or the family as they conceive of it, then they would kind of see the nuclear family as the building block of society. And the kind of ultimate authority, which ties into why they would have, the kind of differential interest in homeschooling or in parental authority over their kids and their kids' vaccination programs and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think particularly language like women don't have to be dependent on their husbands, children do not have to be beholden to their parents. It's more than they just don't like it. I think they would literally see that as satanic.
Like the conservative Christians as a group? Yeah.
As everything that just they don't want, because they think that the internal dependency on each other is important, and they cherish that not only because they cherish the family, but they cherish the family as a political entity and a power structure.
But do you think that when you say they would see it as like satanic, do you think that they actually see people in their 20s who aren't in that kind of structure, who aren't married, who aren't embedded in their family village as some kind of threat to the social order?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it kind of depends on. I mean, obviously everything's on a gradation, but there's been, like, at least in the Christian right, as like an activist movement, I think they've been getting increasingly shrill, increasingly conservative, increasingly reactionary, because they're not winning the argument, and they specifically see young women not getting married young as a specific threat. That's why I really do think we are beginning to see that's one of the reasons that when the Republicans won the House and they got in control of all these state governments, their number one priority was control of the uterus. They went after abortion rights. They went after contraception rights. Here in Mississippi, there was an attempt to get personhood rights for fertilized eggs, which was an overt attack on the birth control pill. Literally they've gotten to this point where they see abortion and, to a degree, contraception as the thing that is creating an opportunity for women to delay marriage, and they do see the delay of marriage as a threat. And it's interesting because if you look at it demographically, it makes a lot of sense. Marriage delaying has been going on in sort of blue state areas for a long time, in urban areas and everything. Only in recent years are you beginning to see the same levels of women marrying later, of fewer people marrying. It's beginning to happen in sort of more rural areas, more red state areas. And I think what we're seeing is a direct reaction to that.
It's interesting. I guess I feel like that perspective on it is not mine, I guess is the fastest way to say that. I tend to see the evangelical, and I'm sure that strain exists, but I would guess it's pretty marginal in the overall group of Christian conservatives. I think that, for example, in the pro-life people, I think a lot of them are just pro-life and just think abortion's wrong. I don't see it as really an attempt to keep me squashed or up in my head as a woman who's not married and so on, and get me back in the kitchen. But so I don't know, but I mean, is there any kind of public statements? I mean, I'm sure you can find people saying this kind of at sort of fringe churches, but
there's polling data that shows when you ask people that people in general, but especially, obviously those who identify as pro-life, under what conditions they would allow or they think abortion is immoral. The number one reason that they think women should not be allowed to have an abortion is if they don't want to get married.
Which poll is that from?
It was American poll. I would have to look.
But it's like a poll of which of these reasons for having an abortion are like inappropriate reasons.
Yeah, for appropriate reasons, and so. Below it was your teenager, you're poor, things like that. And of course, the number one reason that people would allow you to have an abortion is your health or, the fetal deformity. But I found it interesting that nearly 60% of Americans think that you should not be permitted an abortion because you don't want to marry the guy who got you pregnant. And I think that that's a really telling statistic because even if you're just a high schooler, it drops a number of percentage points. And it very clearly speaks to me that there's this image that maybe isn't discussed a lot when there's all this talk about the fetus, but there's this image, and it's certainly thrown at me a lot as a pro-choice writer and activist, that women like me are just sort of being irresponsible and delaying our true path in this life. Huh?
Yeah. That's an interesting data point, because I mean there's a sense in which if it's just a thoroughgoing objection to, like, in a way, the Mississippi law that just or the ballot initiative that just failed was kind of philosophically coherent and obviously failed even in Mississippi, but there was that kind of internal consonance of it that if you're against abortion, you'd be against all this stuff. So I guess I see what you mean, that the kind of variation in what counts as a good abortion and what doesn't count as an okay abortion suggests some kind of normative concerns that extend beyond the life of the fetus into just lifestyle commentary.
Yeah, and I mean, you can't separate that from their interest in abstinence-only education and defunding contraception and things like that as well. That, you know, I mean, I think Mississippi showed that there is a limited amount of tolerance, even on the right, for this overextension of power and this complete freak out. Like, I certainly don't want to characterize all conservatives or even all conservative Christians. Mm-hmm. I think that their feelings are mixed, and that the Mississippi vote showed that they have, as a group, mixed feelings about progress.
Do you think so? Is there a path forward for kind of increased collaboration between pro-choice and pro-life voters? I mean, I'm a social liberal. I'm pro-choice myself, but I don't really vote on that issue. I would vote for a pro-life person if everything else was right. But I think that's kind of a minority view among pro-choice people, or it seems to be from the amount of pushback I get here in Austin for saying that. Do you think that these are kind of just bridges too far to pass, or is there some kind of middle ground of agree to disagree?
I don't think there is much middle ground on something that is as integral to your body, yourself, as your control over your body. But I do think, especially at least on the activist level, I do have hope, however, that pro-life activists have taken it just too damn far. I mean, this personhood amendment, not being able to pass it in Mississippi is I think, hopefully, it may be a fluke, but it might be a harbinger that things are changing, and I think we're just going to have to wait and see on that. But, you know, I think it's an interesting question, because in bad economic times, in the past, there has been more support for reproductive rights in bad economic times, because people begin to sort of see that as just sort of a fundamental economic right. You know, if you're too poor, you know, adding more children to the pile is not going to help your situation at all. And, you know, I have to wonder if that had any kind of influence on it.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I kind of think that there's almost this sort of tacit consensus that, you know, kind of in the Hillary Clinton formulation about being safe, legal, and rare, or maybe they've kind of, and I think it's maybe true of gay marriage too, that there's this sort of growing sense that, you know, a big majority of Americans do support the right to an abortion, maybe with some restrictions as pregnancy proceeds, but the basic right is pretty widely accepted. And with gay marriage, the right is being increasingly widely accepted and is moving through the states quite quickly. So maybe there's this, maybe part of why we're seeing the social conservatives looking more at economic issues or even other issues is just the sense that some of these issues have been decided through the iterative process of politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's probably true. I mean, certainly conservatives have to live in the same world that the rest of us do, so it's not, they don't live in a bubble. They're influenced by all these sorts of things. And I do think that this election is going to be interesting, because even though all the Republican candidates are showing their fealty to social conservatism, they are also, that's seemingly falling away as an issue. Wouldn't you agree in the primary season?
It seems like it certainly is an issue. At the very least, I think it'll be more, maybe a huge issue as we... Well, it's not an issue maybe right now because the absence of the social conservative energy is being... is equally affecting all the candidates, right? But you think back to 2008 or 2004 and 2000, more so than 2008, and Bush certainly got a lot of door-to-door kind of phone banking, campaigning, canvassing help from people who were very passionate volunteers. And I think that McCain didn't command that kind of support, and it looks like neither will any of the current candidates in this increasingly farcical Republican field.
Well, McCain's not one of them, and I think that may, again, the tribal thing. Bush had a whole born-again story, and that's surprisingly effective. But I do agree. I think there's probably more going on than just that. I mean, we have a lot of people in the primary who are acknowledge born again Christians, and I'm sure Perry is, know that Bachman is, Kane is, and yet I don't see any of them seem to really. Either the fractures in the Christian right are showing in the lack of one candidate they're getting behind, or they just don't care anymore. I mean, what's your sense of it?
It's interesting, when Perry got in the race, I was kind of hearing from both sides, I guess, on this, because I had liberal friends who were saying this guy is a religious nut job. He just had this huge prayer rally in Houston. He's praying for rain in the middle of a drought, and so on. And then I hear from conservatives saying this guy backed the vaccine against HPV, and he doesn't have that same rhetorical resonance with the born again Christian voters that Bush had, or that Bachman had, I think. So he was kind of simultaneously too religious for liberal voters and not religious enough for the right, which is part of what's, I think, really, really tanked him in this bid. Probably to the surprise, I think, of some liberals. But yeah, I think you're right, because among the ones who are running, of all the people who have been front runners at one time or the other, the only one who ever was, who really is that kind of fierce Christian conservative is Bachman, and she was the front runner ages ago, like 3 months ago. So yeah, maybe they have just kind of given up or felt so bereft.
It's interesting to me because I would think, like, the whole Perry HPV thing, that's the sort of thing that the old Christian right would have just overlooked. I really think they would have overlooked it, and that seems to me a signal that at least the outspoken portion of the Christian right is just becoming far more reactionary. They've even taken to basically seeing cancer as sort of a way to kind of punish and control, they think, errant females. I don't think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I don't think that they would have held that against Bush if he'd done that.
If he'd done the vaccine or wanted the vaccine to be passed.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I think, they tolerated a lot more with him, and maybe it's because he was an alcoholic who recovered, or maybe it's just that they were a lot more relaxed.
I think that, evangelicals, so I think that one thing I've kind of noticed with them is that there's almost this, it's hard to describe, but they have this kind of constant stream of references to their faith if they're very, very devout. It's like a metaphysical set of beliefs that affects how they tell stories about causation. So, like, how did you meet your wife? God put her in my path, kind of thing. It kind of recurs quite frequently, and Bush had that much more than Perry. And maybe Perry just never quite gelled with the Christian right in that way. Of course, it's kind of hard to tell in Texas because the whole state is run by Republicans. So there's not a lot of pushback to the Christian rights, I guess, ideas as they arise. Although I think it is somewhat less Christianist in its orientation than it appears to be with some of the top level stuff about abstinence and about the school board and so on.
Yeah, that might be true. I mean, maybe what it is that Bush was able to do that. He was kind of able to code switch a little from Texan to a sort of way of being Christian that was much more evocative for the Midwest religious right. Whereas Perry just comes off as a Rootin' Tootin' cowboy, and I don't know if they really care for that at all. I don't know if that's their aesthetic, if there isn't any aesthetic appreciation for that. That's a very unique to Texas kind of stance to take, and I think that it seemed to me that he only got his frontrunner status initially because a lot of the East Coast media just thinks that that's hilarious, and they gave him a lot of coverage for it.
Yeah, but he had. But then he did actually. I think he had. I don't know if Gingrich has since exceeded him, but for a while he was polling higher in the polls than Romney has to date. So it's interesting in this primary how these Republican voters are seemingly just coalescing around different people at the same time, and I can't really track who gets what when as far as the voters go. Apart from the fact they're just, now they're just going through the rest of the list, I guess. But like, what did Gingrich do in the past week to suddenly be the front runner?
He hasn't embarrassed himself in their mind. This is going to last a week. I mean, you know.
I mean, it's not like that debate. He was kind of a little bit hostile and rude in that debate. I don't know if that's a new selling point. But yeah, there he goes.
Yeah, no, I think it's definitely without Kane, they don't have anybody to support. Like, Bachmann's crazy. Kane is now awful. And kind of, it's becoming clear he's kind of dumb too. Perry, you know what? I really think a lot of people think he's a drunk now, and I don't know that that's fair at all.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think at this point it's safe to say that Romney's going to walk away with it. Personally, as somebody who kind of watches the religious right out, I'm fascinated to see how they struggle with voting for a Mormon because, they can reconcile that in 15 different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I saw Land speak, he had this kind of funny speech where he said, Mormonism is a cult. It's the fourth Abrahamic religion. But evangelicals are going to coalesce around Romney because he's not Obama. So it really kind of covered all the points about Mormonism, every possible perspective about Mormonism that you could do in 30 seconds. I think they'll vote for Romney, probably not with the passion they did for Bush. I'm not sure that it does seem hard to see who else would be the nominee at this point, but I also find it difficult to see how somebody can be the nominee if they've been running for the past 5 years and just can't crack this 25% threshold. It's crazy.
I think I can see it happening because their sort of tribalism will help them. I think more to the point. I think one thing that they're gonna at least. I mean, your average not that religious conservative is gonna vote for Romney and they don't care, right? The Christian conservatives, if they really are struggling with the Mormon thing, I think what it's eventually going to happen is like. I've always been amazed at the way that they can kind of do this like two-step where they're like, on one hand, you're going to hell. On the other hand, we can be friends.
It's not personal.
Yeah, and I mean, they've been doing this to Jewish people for roughly forever, so I don't see why they can't just expand the bubble of people that they claim to love, but who they also believe are going to hell to Mormons as well.
Yeah, it was strange to me, this Land's idea that Mormonism is going to be the fourth Abrahamic religion, because it seems like that actually gives the Mormon Church a very strong footing. That it otherwise, you think that if Christians just started treating Mormons like Christians, which I think they are, then over time it's still a pretty young church. It would just evolve into a more conventional-looking form of Christianity, as indeed a lot of denominations have done over their history. So the idea of kind of pushing them away so they become a separate entity just seems counterproductive to me, but I guess I'm not a Baptist theologian. So.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think they're not thinking about it rationally like that, though. I think that the threat of Mormonism is that they do like conservative Christianity better than conservative Christians do. I think that they see them as competing for souls in a marketplace, and I think they're a little jealous because, the Mormons have done a really great job of putting forward the, like, shiny, happy, clean teeth, nice hair, we don't have premarital sex, we don't get divorced, we each have 1 million children image that fundamentalist Christians really wish that they could get across. Like, that's what they want to look like. In their minds, that's what they look like. But then they actually look at their church and they're like, we have divorced people. We have kids that are having sex. We give them these purity rings. They wear it for 6 months and they give it up. There's a pregnant teenager. In their minds, they can't hold it together. They look at the Mormons. I think that they're jealous. That is my theory. Now, obviously, if you actually probably got to know some Mormons, or if they got to know some Mormons, they'd probably find out that they're not as shiny and perfect as they make themselves out to be. But, from a distance, I can sort of see how that might seem threatening.
I wonder about that actually. Can you if you're, I mean, because you can be like a Methodist and you can be sort of a sloppy Methodist or kind of a lazy Methodist. I mean, you can be sort of a Christmas and Easter Methodist, and it's generally okay. But can you be a sort of Christmas and Easter Mormon, or do you have to be on your best behavior at all times? Just as a sort of separate line of inquiry that I intend to pursue at some point. But I guess kind of to wrap up this field, very very fractured. Do you see any of them who could appeal to liberal voters, which I imagine you are? Are there any of the Republican candidates in this field that you would consider voting for, or
no,
or that you're curious?
I think Obama is going. I think at the current state that it is, Obama is going to get all the Democrats, all the liberals. And unless Romney has some amazing push, I see Obama picking up pretty much all the swing, too. I just don't see him. Like, his poll numbers keep getting floated around, and it's like, yeah, when you poll somebody independent of their competition, you can say whatever you want about them. But when it's actually Barack Obama and Mitt Romney on a stage, I just don't see it happening. I feel Romney is just going to be pulling the losing, ticket again.
Do you think they have a stronger candidate? And there's this kind of, I don't know if it's quite conventional wisdom, but there's this widespread belief that Romney is the strongest general election candidate. Do you think that's true? Yeah, because if you want to beat a Barack Obama, all you want, like in lieu of having an actually strong candidate, which they don't have, you want a candidate that is an empty suit, and you just hope that the economy is bad enough that people will vote for anybody but Obama. Like, the less that they can project, like the less that the candidate has, the more he seems like an empty suit. The better the better you can project your hopes and fears on him, instead of, if it's like Herman Cain, everyone's going to look at him and be like, that's the sexual harassment pizza guy, And I don't think you get more than 40% of the vote with that, I don't know. What do you think? I mean, what do you think? Do you think? I mean, the pizza guy part, I'm totally on board with, but then the sexual harassment guy, that's not my preferred chosen candidate. But I'm still an undecided voter, so I feel very very lucky because I get to feel very smug and judgmental for the next what do we have here next 12 months.
Do you think that there's any candidates that are better than Romney's for just politically speaking against Obama?
I was wondering this because there's this kind of, people say that, or I think there's a sense that a Romney-Obama election would be like a Bush-Kerry election, and that like a Perry-Obama election would be like Goldwater-LBJ. But it seems like the Goldwater-LBJ model is actually better for both parties, because then you have one candidate who wins, like really, really wins, like clearly wins, but then one candidate who kind of goes to bat for their ideas and can at least animate the next generation of candidates. Whereas the Bush-Kerry kind of election just leaves everyone feeling sort of unhappy and unenthused and unwilling to cede much ground to the guy who actually won, but equally uninspired on the other side to go back and resume the fight. So
I think that's fair. Well,
yeah.
I think we can leave it at that.
I think so. Great to talk to you today. Have fun down at the park.
Thank you. And say hi to the city of Austin for me.
I will, as always. Good talking with you, Amanda.
Same.
Bye.
Bye.